Lyra stood at the edge of the frozen plateau, her pale eyes scanning the horizon of Serath's moon. The wind cut through her thin robes, but she felt nothing, not the sting of cold, not the ache in her muscles. Pain was foreign to her, as it had been to every Veyran since birth. Her people were proud of this. Their bodies were perfected through generations of selective adaptation and genetic engineering to survive anything. Emotions were considered distractions, pain a weakness. Lyra had grown up believing these truths. She had never known fear that hurt, or sorrow that pressed on the chest. She moved through the world with precise efficiency, untouched by the fragility humans so often displayed in stories brought by travelers and smugglers. Her duty that day was simple. She had been sent to survey the ice plains for any signs of the incoming storm the elders had predicted. The sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, streaks of violet lightning slicing through the clouds. Lyra walked over the surface of the frozen ground, her boots crunching over the brittle frost, unmoved by the harsh elements. Even as the wind tried to batter her down, she felt nothing. It was a feeling she had always considered natural, until now. Today, something within her was slightly off. A curiosity had begun to stir, subtle but persistent. Lyra didn't understand it, but she ignored it, telling herself that any unnecessary distraction was illogical. That afternoon, the sky darkened faster than expected. A storm rolled across the plains, fierce and sudden. Lyra scanned the horizon for shelter, but there was none in sight. Her instincts were sharp, her movements controlled, and she had survived countless storms without flinching. Yet this time her gaze caught a strange metallic object half buried in the ice, a ship, small and clearly damaged. This was not unusual on Serath. Explorers from other systems often crashed here, and the Veyrans had rules for handling outsiders. They were to be reported, and if necessary, captured for study. Lyra's training kicked in, and she approached the ship cautiously. She had been trained to feel no fear, to act with logic and precision, but her curiosity, something she rarely experienced, pushed her forward. The ship's hull was dented, ice forming along its seams. A human figure was visible through a cracked window, unconscious and shivering. Lyra studied him for several minutes. His skin was pale, lips blue from the cold, and his body small and fragile compared to the robust forms of her own species. Despite her logical training, a flicker of concern passed through her, a thought she had never allowed herself before. Should she leave him? The Veyran code would have demanded it. But the curiosity was stronger than obedience. She moved closer, her fingers brushing against the cold metal as she opened the hatch. The human stirred, coughing violently. Lyra observed carefully. He looked weak, vulnerable but alive. He met her gaze with eyes wide in panic, fear clear in their brown depths. Lyra felt nothing. No fear, no empathy. But she registered the signals, the rapid pulse of his heart, the shivering of his body. Logic dictated she could help him survive until rescue arrived. Emotion had no place in her reasoning, yet something inside whispered differently. She didn't understand it. She had never felt that whisper before. "Move carefully," she said, her voice calm and neutral, though unfamiliar warmth tinged it faintly. She helped him out of the ship, supporting his weight as best she could. The storm was relentless now, wind and ice battering them from all directions. Her body resisted the cold perfectly, but she noticed that the human could not. His teeth chattered uncontrollably and his movements were erratic. Lyra adjusted her grip, moving him to a nearby rocky overhang for minimal shelter. She stripped off part of her own robe to cover him. For the first time, she became aware of a strange sensation, a desire to protect, to shield another being from harm. She noted it as an anomaly but did not understand it. She had no name for it. As the hours passed, the storm worsened. Lyra remained beside the human, observing him, monitoring his condition. He shivered violently, and she realized that despite her lack of sensation, his discomfort was influencing her. She noticed herself reacting almost instinctively, moving closer, adjusting the robes, shielding him from the worst of the wind. Her mind raced with strange questions. Why did she care about his suffering? Why did the sight of him struggling disturb her in a way no human could see? Logic offered no answers. This was new, unexplored, and it frightened her more than any storm ever could. Night fell and the temperature plummeted. The human's condition worsened, his body trembling, skin pale under the dim moonlight. Lyra calculated the severity of hypothermia, and realized that unless she acted, he could die. The Veyron teachings had never accounted for this scenario. They had assumed that interactions with weaker species were to be managed with efficiency and cold detachment. Yet here she was, feeling an unnameable need to keep him alive. In the end, she did what any logical being who had suddenly developed concern would do. She removed more of her own covering and wrapped him closer to her, holding him as the wind howled around them. For the first time, Lyra became aware of the human heartbeat, steady but strained, against her side. It was foreign and fascinating. She did not flinch, did not feel discomfort, yet she could not deny the awareness that coursed through her body. She had no words for it, no training to explain it, only the strange realization that she was experiencing a connection unlike anything she had ever known. As they huddled together, she noticed something else: warmth. Human warmth, fragile and yet enduring, spreading in a way that her own cold body could not replicate. She felt it radiate, an unfamiliar sensation that made her pause. Curiosity became something more. It became an understanding that this human was different, that he mattered, that somehow his presence was altering her perception. Ethan, the human, murmured in his sleep, turning toward her for comfort without knowing what he was doing. Lyra's hand hovered over his arm, instinctively adjusting the way he rested against her. It was careful, measured, but there was tenderness in it, a concept she had never encountered. In the long hours of that night, as the storm raged on, Lyra found herself studying every detail: his breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers twitched. Each small movement fascinated her. She catalogued everything with the precision of her Veyron training. But beneath that, a quiet, unacknowledged sensation bloomed in her chest. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. By dawn, the storm had passed. Lyra had watched the human's condition slowly stabilize. The sun broke over the horizon, reflecting off the ice, creating dazzling flashes of light. She realized she had been sitting there all night, never once feeling the cold or fatigue herself. Yet she had been entirely focused on his survival. For a being designed to feel nothing, it was a revelation. She wondered what this meant for her. What did it mean to care? What did it mean to feel? She had no answers, only an expanding awareness of her own limitations, her own awakening. When Ethan finally stirred awake, blinking in confusion at the blinding sunlight, Lyra stood silently, observing. He looked at her with gratitude, but she could not interpret it fully. He reached out a hand and she instinctively took it to steady him. The warmth that flowed through that simple touch caused her to pause. There was no pain, yet there was sensation, a prickling of awareness she had never experienced. The realization settled in her mind slowly. Humans were not weak for feeling pain, fear, or warmth. They were powerful because of it. She could not yet name the sensation that had stirred within her, but she knew it was something entirely new, something that challenged everything she had been taught. As the day progressed, Ethan began repairing the ship, carefully removing ice and damaged panels. Lyra assisted, observing every action with sharp eyes. She learned to anticipate his needs, to hand him tools without him asking, to protect him from slips and exposure. Each time she helped, each small gesture, her body responded with awareness, a connection that was unfamiliar yet compelling. She found herself smiling faintly at his clumsy movements, though she could not understand why. The sensation was foreign, yet it delighted her. By nightfall, they had completed temporary repairs and the ship could barely sustain flight. Lyra offered to stay with him until rescue arrived. She did not know why, except that logic now intertwined with something unexpected. There was a pull she could not explain, a draw toward this fragile human who had survived the storm only because of her intervention. That night, as the cold pressed in once more, Lyra prepared for another long, frigid night. But this time she made a choice. She would not merely shield him with her presence from the cold. She would share the warmth of her body, lying beside him to protect him from the freezing air. It was an action that defied every Veyron code she had been taught, yet she did it without hesitation. For the first time in her life, she felt something stirring within her, something alive and potent, a sensation she could neither define nor resist. In that moment, lying beside the human, Lyra realized that the world was not as simple as she had believed. Pain, warmth, connection, and awareness were no longer abstract concepts to her. They were real, tangible, and undeniable. And for the first time she understood that her own journey had only just begun. The human beside her, fragile and imperfect, had awakened apart. The next morning, Lyra awoke to the soft hum of the repaired ship and the muted glow of Sarath's twin suns reflecting off the icy plains. The warmth from the human beside her had lingered through the night, and for the first time she noticed the subtle rhythm of his breathing as more than just a sign of life. It was a rhythm she unconsciously synchronized with, a gentle beat that calmed her in ways she could not fully explain. Ethan shifted in his sleep, mumbling quietly. Lyra observed him carefully, analyzing the rise and fall of his chest, the slight tension in his muscles. Logic dictated that this was a survival mechanism, but an unfamiliar sensation tickled the edges of her consciousness, a sense of anticipation, a quiet awareness that she had never felt before. She rose carefully, keeping her movements precise so as not to disturb him. The storm from the previous night had left the ice plains glittering with a layer of frost, the air sharp and clean. Lyra had always thrived in harsh conditions, but now, the beauty of the dawn seemed to evoke something she couldn't name. It was not awe, at least not in the traditional human sense, but a peculiar pull, a sensation that made her chest feel lighter and her senses sharper. She moved to gather supplies from the ship, carefully cataloging what had been damaged and what could be salvaged. Ethan stirred again, now fully awake, blinking at the light with confusion. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra regarded him with her usual calm, noting the shivering and pallor of his skin. "You are safe," she replied simply. "You were exposed to the storm. It would have ended you if I had not intervened." Ethan tried to sit up and she allowed him to, steadying him with a hand on his shoulder. The warmth of his skin under her touch caused a flicker in her chest, a faint, unfamiliar flutter that made her pause. She noted it as a response, a physiological reaction, but even as she cataloged it, she could not deny its presence. Her body was registering more than the simple facts of survival. It was registering awareness of him. Ethan's gaze met hers, and for a moment he studied her carefully. "You saved me," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Lyra inclined her head, acknowledging the statement. "You were at risk," she said. It was logical to prevent death. Logic was her primary guide, yet the words felt hollow even to her own ears. She realized that there was more than logic driving her actions now, but she could not name it. She had no frame of reference for the sensation stirring inside her. She ignored it, focusing instead on the practical matters of repair and survival. The morning passed with careful work. Ethan assisted as best he could, but his human fragility was apparent. Lyra instructed him on basic procedures, showing him how to handle tools and avoid exposure to the cold. She observed him closely, noting every small movement, every lapse in attention, every sign of fatigue. Each time he faltered, she instinctively moved to correct him or shield him. There was no logical requirement to act beyond efficiency, yet she found herself doing more than necessary, adjusting his clothing, handing him supplies before he asked, and positioning him out of harm's way whenever possible. Each small action carried a ripple of unfamiliar sensation within her, a tingling awareness she cataloged but did not understand. By midday, the ship was operational enough to survive the harsh conditions, though it could not fly at full capacity. Lyra studied the exterior carefully, checking the integrity of the hull and energy systems. Ethan wandered nearby, observing her movements with cautious curiosity. "You work differently than anyone I've ever seen," he said finally. Lyra paused, tilting her head. "Differently?" she asked. He nodded, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You don't seem to get tired. You don't complain. You just act. But sometimes it feels like you're thinking about more than just efficiency." She considered his words, unsure how to respond. Logic offered no answer for what he was implying. The human's observation lingered in her mind longer than she expected. She replayed the words over and over, attempting to categorize them within the framework of Veyron understanding. It made no sense. Her body had always been a machine of precision, unaffected by fatigue, by cold, by emotional distraction. Yet now, she found herself considering the possibility that she was reacting to the human's presence in ways beyond mere physical necessity. Each time he smiled at a small accomplishment or flinched at the sudden gusts of wind, she noted a strange tension in her chest, a sensation that felt foreign and persistent. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, temperatures plummeted again, Lyra instructed Ethan to remain close to the ship. She moved beside him as he attempted to rest, offering what little warmth she could provide. Her own body resisted the cold perfectly, yet she adjusted her position to maximize his comfort, noting the soft rise and fall of his chest against her side. He murmured in his sleep, shifting closer to her. She observed him without thought at first, but gradually became aware of the sensations it elicited. A warmth spread through her that she could not describe. It was not pain, not physical exertion, but an emotional resonance she had never encountered. She catalogued it, studied it, and felt a faint sense of fascination, tinged with confusion. Later, a subtle sound caught her attention, the shifting of ice near the horizon. A fissure had formed, a thin crevice stretching across the plains. Logic dictated caution. Such features could be dangerous. Lyra moved to examine it, keeping Ethan within a safe distance. As she stepped closer, the ice beneath her foot cracked with a sharp sound. She paused, heart, not the human kind, but the physiological organ, registering the change in pressure. Ethan, startled, stepped forward to help. Lyra recoiled slightly, unaccustomed to human instinctive reactions, but found herself mirroring his caution. Together they navigated the precarious area, each step measured yet coordinated in a way that felt surprisingly natural. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Ethan was exhausted, and Lyra realized that even with her own immunity to cold, his survival depended on continuous care. She led him back to the ship, guiding him inside and covering him with additional layers of clothing and insulation. They sat close together to share warmth. At first, it was purely practical, a calculated measure to preserve human life. But as the hours passed, Lyra became increasingly aware of the rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his skin, and the soft sounds of his exhalations. A strange fascination emerged. She found herself studying him with the intensity of a scientist observing a rare specimen, yet the sensation went beyond curiosity. It was deeper, more intricate, and she could not analyze it. In the quiet of the night, Ethan stirred again, speaking softly in his sleep. "Thank you," he murmured, though he did not fully wake. Lyra paused, listening. Logic told her that the words were meaningless. They were merely sounds produced by a human's recovery process. Yet for reasons she could not explain, she felt a ripple of warmth spread through her chest. She catalogued the sensation, attempted to understand it, but it remained an anomaly. She realized with a flicker of awareness that she had spent the entire day and night, not merely ensuring his survival, but attending to him in ways that went beyond necessity. She had acted out of something that was not efficiency, not instinct, but something entirely new. The next morning, Lyra awoke to a subtle sound, the human moving about inside the ship. Ethan had begun repairing some of the ship's internal systems, his hands shaking slightly as he worked with precision despite fatigue. Lyra observed him, noting each movement, the strain on his small body and the determination in his eyes. She realized that she felt something akin to pride, though she could not name it. The human's persistence, his will to survive despite his fragile form, elicited a response in her that she had never experienced. It was not a logical response, yet it was undeniable. As the day wore on, Lyra found herself increasingly aware of the human in ways she could not explain. Each time he spoke, she listened intently, noting patterns, inflections, and the subtle changes in his expression. Each time he paused, she waited, anticipating his next action. She realized that the sensations she experienced were not physical, but emotional in nature, something entirely new for a Varen. Her species had always dismissed emotion as a distraction, yet she now understood that it was something far more intricate, far more compelling, and far more dangerous than they had ever admitted. By evening, the human had completed the temporary repairs needed for the ship to function at minimal capacity. Lyra watched him work, her mind cataloging every detail, yet she could not shake the sense of connection that had grown between them. For the first time, she experienced a faint unease when he looked away or moved out of her line of sight. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She realized that she had begun to rely on his presence, that his survival, his comfort, and his simple existence had become entwined with her own awareness in ways she could not define. That night, as temperatures dropped once more, Lyra chose to remain close to him. She adjusted her position carefully, ensuring that he would remain warm. that his fragile human form would not succumb to the cold. As she lay beside him, she became aware of a subtle rhythm, a pulse, a warmth, a life force that was entirely human. She had never felt anything like it before. And the morning sun broke across the horizon, casting pale gold light over the icy plains of Serath. Lyra awoke slowly, her eyes tracing the patterns of frost that glittered like diamonds across the frozen ground. Beside her, Ethan stirred, blinking as if adjusting to the brightness. She watched him with the quiet attentiveness she had learned to sustain, noting the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed and curled unconsciously. There was a fragility in him that fascinated her, a physical delicacy she had never experienced in her own body. And yet, despite it, there was resilience in the human, a quiet determination that drew her attention in ways she could not fully comprehend. Yesterday's storm had left its mark on the environment, but also on the two of them. Lyra had spent the night beside him, ensuring that his fragile human body did not succumb to the cold. She had felt warmth radiate from him, and even though she did not feel cold or fatigue herself, the experience of shielding him from the bitter wind had been unexpectedly compelling. She catalogued every sensation, every subtle response, yet there was one thing she could not quantify, an emotional pull that made her chest tighten in a way she had never known. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Ethan stretched, flexing his limbs carefully to shake off stiffness. "You didn't sleep?" he asked, his voice still thick with the remnants of sleep. Lyra inclined her head, the only response she deemed necessary. Words had always been secondary to observation for her kind. But as he regarded her with a faint smile, something within her stirred again. The human's presence carried a sense of life she had never fully encountered in her people. It was unpredictable, irregular yet persistent, and she found herself compelled to remain near him even without conscious thought. The morning was filled with repairs. Ethan worked on reinforcing the ship's hull, carefully applying patches over cracked panels and frozen conduits. Lyra assisted where she could, observing every action, noting each careful movement, and anticipating what he would need next. Every time he fumbled or hesitated, she moved to correct him, not out of necessity, but from a sudden impulse she could not explain. Her hands brushed against his occasionally, adjustments made with mechanical precision. Yet she noticed an odd warmth spreading through her chest each time she did so. It was a sensation entirely new, one that puzzled her analytical mind. By midday, the temporary repairs had stabilized the ship enough for short-range movement. Ethan stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold air. "We should be able to get to the nearby ridge," he said. "From there, we might find a signal to contact a passing vessel." Lyra nodded, her mind cataloging every variable in the plan. Yet as she prepared to move, she noticed a subtle limp in Ethan's step, a sign of fatigue she had not anticipated. His human body, though resilient in many ways, had limits she could not ignore. Without conscious reasoning, she moved closer, steadying him with a hand on his arm. The warmth of his skin against hers sent a strange, almost electric feeling through her chest, and for the first time, she realized she was responding to him in a way beyond observation or logic. The path to the ridge was treacherous. Ice crunched underfoot and hidden fissures threatened to give way at any moment. Lyra led the way, her sharp Varen senses detecting every subtle change in the terrain. Ethan followed carefully, adjusting his steps to avoid weak patches. At one point, a thin sheet of ice cracked beneath his foot, causing him to stumble. Lyra reacted instantly, catching him before he fell. Her hand pressed against his chest to steady him, and she felt the rapid rise and fall of his heartbeat. It was strong, irregular, and alive. The sensation resonated within her in a way that made her pause, an unfamiliar flutter that she catalogued but could not fully understand. "You okay?" she asked, her voice neutral yet carrying a subtle note of concern she had never expressed before. Ethan nodded, brushing himself off. "Thanks to you," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. That simple acknowledgement stirred something in her, a warmth she had no name for. She had always understood gratitude as a form of social signal among her kind. But this felt different, intimate, potent, personal. Her chest tightened slightly, and she realized that she had begun to feel more than she had ever anticipated. The ridge provided a clear vantage point. From there, Ethan scanned the horizon for any sign of rescue ships or communication signals. Lyra watched him, noting every subtle movement, the tension in his muscles, the slight furrow in his brow. She found herself thinking about him constantly, monitoring his condition not just for survival but for his comfort. Her analytical mind recognized the absurdity, yet she could not suppress the sensations coursing through her. There was a fascination, a pull, a recognition that this human's presence was now central to her awareness. As they prepared to descend from the ridge, a sudden noise echoed from the ice plains below. A massive chunk of ice had shifted, sending shards crashing down the slope. Ethan reacted instinctively, attempting to shield Lyra, but she moved faster, pulling him aside with precise timing. Yet in doing so, her arm scraped against the jagged ice. She gasped, a sound she had never made before. Sharp, searing pain shot through her arm. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she looked at the thin line of blood forming across her skin. She had always believed herself immune to pain, incapable of feeling such sensations. Yet here it was, intense, real, and undeniable. Ethan immediately pressed his hands to her arm, his own concern evident. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice urgent. Lyra nodded faintly, still processing the strange burning sensation. "It is new," she admitted, her words careful. He frowned, gently applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "Pain isn't weakness," he said softly. "It's your body telling you you're alive." She studied his expression, the way he handled her injury with care and precision, and felt another unfamiliar warmth bloom within her. It was not just the pain itself, but the connection, the shared concern, the human response that made the experience wholly transformative. The evening was quiet, filled with the subtle tasks of tending to the minor injury and preparing for another night in the harsh environment. Lyra found herself sitting closer to Ethan than necessary, her body reacting instinctively to his presence. The pain in her arm had faded slightly, replaced by a lingering awareness that she had never encountered. She examined her own reaction, realizing that she had not only felt pain, but also concern, relief, and curiosity about the human beside her. Her mind cataloged every detail, yet could not fully explain the emotional resonance that had accompanied the physical sensation. Night came, darker and colder than before. Lyra positioned herself beside Ethan once more, ensuring he remained warm and shielded from the freezing air. She adjusted her posture carefully, noting the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Every movement, every breath seemed to ripple through her own awareness, creating a connection she could neither define nor resist. She realized with quiet astonishment that the pain she had felt earlier had opened something inside her. It had made her aware not only of her own limits, but of her capacity to care, to react, and to connect in ways she had never thought possible. Ethan murmured in his sleep, shifting slightly closer to her. Lyra observed him without thought at first, then realized she was holding her breath, noting every subtle detail of his expression and movement. The pain from her arm had faded, yet the awareness it had sparked lingered like a quiet ember in her chest. She could not name the sensation, but she catalogued it meticulously, analyzing every aspect of it. It was not discomfort, not fatigue, not weakness. It was a recognition, a connection, a spark of something deeply human. And for the first time in her life, Lyra understood that experiencing pain did not make her weak. It made her alive. As the night deepened, Lyra's thoughts wandered. She considered her people, their rigid beliefs about emotion and pain, and realized how narrow their understanding had been. Pain had always been seen as a liability, a hindrance to survival. Yet here, with the human beside her, she had discovered that pain could also be instructive, illuminating, and even beautiful in its own way. It had shown her that she was capable of feeling, of connecting, of reacting with awareness beyond mere logic. By the early hours of the morning, Lyra finally allowed herself to rest, her body still close to Ethan's for warmth and stability. She reflected on the day, on the strange sensation of pain, and on the unfamiliar warmth she felt toward the human. She realized that she had begun to experience not just physical reactions, but emotional awareness, a capacity to care, to respond, and to connect in ways that defied her Veyron training. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. When the sun rose again, casting its pale light over the frozen landscape, Lyra was ready to face the new day. She had discovered something fundamental about herself, something that would change everything she had believed about life, survival, and connection. The pain she had felt, the warmth she had experienced, and the subtle emotional resonance with Ethan had opened a door she could not close. For the first time in her life, she understood that being alive meant more than efficiency and endurance. It meant connection, awareness, and the capacity to feel. And in that understanding, Lyra knew that her journey had truly begun. The days following the incident with her arm were quiet, but tense. Lyra had begun to understand the new sensations that coursed through her body. Warmth, awareness, and something that hovered at the edge of thought. Emotion. She did not yet have the words for it, nor the understanding to fully process it, but it was undeniable. She found herself monitoring Ethan constantly, not just for his survival, but for his comfort, for his well-being. The storm and the accident had created a bond between them, subtle but growing, one that went beyond mere necessity. Ethan, despite the harsh conditions and his human fragility, was determined to help. He moved carefully through the repairs, his hands steady as he worked on the ship. Lyra observed him with keen attention, noting every subtle shift in posture, every flinch, every sign of fatigue. Each small movement drew her focus, and she found that she felt a strange satisfaction when he accomplished a task successfully. It was as if the human's victories resonated inside her in a way she had never anticipated. She catalogued these reactions meticulously, but deep down she knew they were not simply analytical. Something deeper was emerging, something human in nature yet entirely new to her. One afternoon, while examining a damaged panel on the ship's exterior, Ethan slipped on a patch of ice and twisted his ankle. He cried out in surprise and pain, clutching his leg. Lyra reacted immediately, moving faster than he could comprehend, her hands gripping his body to steady him. The sight of him in pain made her chest tighten, an unfamiliar ache that was not her own injury but a reaction to his suffering. She realized with sudden clarity that her understanding of pain had evolved. She could now sense the impact of pain on another, and it stirred her in ways she could not control. "You're hurt," she said, her voice soft, though normally her tone would have been neutral. Ethan looked at her with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Yeah, twisted my ankle," he admitted, wincing. Lyra's hands moved instinctively, checking the joint for damage and wrapping it carefully with strips of insulation to keep it stable. Her touch was precise, but there was a subtle tenderness that she had never displayed before. She catalogued the sensation, noting it as an anomaly, yet part of her wanted nothing more than to ensure he was safe and comfortable. That evening, the temperature dropped sharply. They huddled together inside the ship, sharing body heat to survive the cold. Lyra lay close to Ethan, her arm lightly draped over his side to steady him, ensuring that he remained warm through the freezing night. As he drifted into a fitful sleep, she studied his face, noting the way his eyelids fluttered, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his breath came in quiet, irregular rhythms. Each detail was a point of data, yet she could not ignore the stirring of warmth and fascination in her chest. Her mind catalogued it, analyzed it, and yet failed to fully explain the sensation. It was curiosity, care, and connection all at once, a combination she had never experienced before. Over the next few days, Lyra's awareness of Ethan deepened. She found herself anticipating his needs, offering assistance before he even asked. She adjusted his clothing, handed him tools, and guided him around icy patches with precision. Every action carried with it a subtle warmth in her chest, a sensation she could neither suppress nor fully understand. She began to notice changes in her own responses. Her pulse quickened when he smiled at her. Her thoughts lingered on him during moments of silence, and she felt a strange unease when he was momentarily out of her sight. It was disorienting yet captivating, and she found herself increasingly drawn to his presence. One afternoon, while surveying the frozen landscape for signs of rescue, Lyra and Ethan encountered a shifting ridge of ice that threatened to collapse. Ethan instinctively stepped forward to help her navigate the treacherous terrain, but Lyra, recognizing the danger, pushed him back. In doing so, a chunk of ice slipped beneath her foot and she twisted her ankle. Sharp pain shot up her leg and she stumbled. Ethan caught her immediately, supporting her weight with careful hands. "I've got you," he said firmly, concern evident in his voice. The sound of it, the tone, the emotion, resonated deeply within Lyra. She realized that this was not merely a mechanical action to prevent harm. It was care, genuine and intentional, and it stirred something in her that was both confusing and exhilarating. They spent the evening tending to their minor injuries, resting and sharing warmth in the small confines of the ship. Lyra found herself reflecting on the sensations that had emerged within her. Pain, she had learned, was not just a warning signal for the body. It was an experience that connected beings to one another, a shared understanding of vulnerability and resilience. And now, warmth, awareness, and care were intertwining with it in ways she had never anticipated. The human beside her had become a catalyst for this awakening, showing her that there were aspects of life beyond efficiency and survival that could be both powerful and transformative. As the days passed, their bond continued to deepen. Lyra began to experience subtle emotional responses, curiosity that lingered, fascination with human behavior, and an increasing desire to ensure Ethan's safety. She found herself observing him even when he was unaware, noting every gesture, every micro-expression, every sigh. Each observation carried with it an unfamiliar sense of engagement, an awareness that went beyond simple analysis. She catalogued it meticulously, yet she could not deny the growing influence it had over her thoughts and actions. Ethan, for his part, began to notice the changes in Lyra. He observed the way her gaze lingered on him, the careful attention she gave to his movements, and the subtle shifts in posture and expression that hinted at concern and awareness. He recognized that she was different from other beings he had encountered. Her analytical mind was paired with something he could sense but not fully define. He responded to it cautiously, testing the boundaries of her reactions, and was rewarded with moments of unexpected tenderness and care. Each interaction reinforced the connection between them, deepening their understanding of one another. One evening, as the twin suns dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep violet streaked with icy clouds. Lyra and Ethan sat side by side observing the frozen plains. The quiet was profound, broken only by the distant creaking of shifting ice and the occasional gust of wind. Lyra felt a strange contentment in the silence, a sense of connection that she had never experienced. The warmth of Ethan's presence beside her, the rhythm of his breathing, and the simple act of sharing space created a profound awareness within her, a recognition that she was no longer merely observing life, but participating in it. As night fell, the temperature dropped further, and they prepared for another cold night. Lyra positioned herself close to Ethan once more, sharing warmth and ensuring his comfort. She studied his face as he drifted into sleep, noting every detail with precision, yet feeling an emotional resonance she could not define. The sensations were powerful and disorienting, yet she found them captivating. For the first time in her life, she recognized that connection, care, and emotional awareness were not weaknesses. They were strengths enabling understanding, resilience, and survival in ways she had never imagined. During the quiet hours, a subtle change occurred in Lyra's awareness. She became acutely aware of her own heartbeat, of the sensations in her chest, and of the warmth radiating from the human beside her. Pain, warmth, and emotional resonance had merged into a complex network of awareness, creating a profound sense of being alive. She reflected on the events of the past days, the storm, the injuries, the shared moments of care, and realized that each experience had contributed to this awakening. The human had not only survived the environment, but had also awakened something within her that defied explanation. By the time the first light of dawn broke across the frozen horizon, Lyra felt a quiet sense of understanding. She had learned that pain was not a weakness, that warmth and connection were vital, and that emotional awareness could coexist with logic and efficiency. The bond with Ethan had transformed her perception of herself, her environment, and her understanding of life. She had begun to explore dimensions of experience that her species had dismissed for generations, discovering that being alive meant more than survival. It meant awareness, connection, and the capacity to feel. As they prepared for another day of navigating the harsh landscape, Lyra reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She recognized that the human beside her was not just a companion or a charge to protect. He was a catalyst for transformation, a being whose presence challenged and expanded her understanding of life. The days ahead would undoubtedly bring more challenges, but she faced them with a newfound awareness and resilience, confident that the bond they had forged would guide them through the trials to come. And as they stepped out onto the frozen plains once more, moving toward the uncertain horizon, Lyra felt a quiet but profound truth settle within her. Life, pain, warmth, and connection were intertwined, and in embracing them, She had discovered the first true sense of what it meant to be alive. The dawn broke slowly over the frozen plains, painting the ice with streaks of pale gold and violet. Lyra stood on the deck of the ship, her eyes scanning the horizon. The events of the past days had changed everything. She had discovered the unexpected depths of human resilience, the subtle power of care, and the startling reality of pain and warmth. And most of all, she had realized that her connection with Ethan was no longer a matter of simple necessity. It was something deeper, something she could not yet fully name. Ethan appeared beside her, leaning on the makeshift crutches he had fashioned from parts of the ship. His ankle had healed enough for him to walk, but the effort left him pale and tired. Lyra instinctively moved to support him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The warmth of his skin against hers sent a subtle thrill through her chest, a sensation that she now recognized and embraced. She had catalogued the feeling countless times, analyzed it with meticulous care, and yet it always surprised her, each moment as sharp and new as the first. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice neutral in tone but carrying a faint undercurrent of concern. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied. They stepped carefully onto the frozen plains, moving toward the ridge where they had first spotted the distant signal of hope. The terrain was treacherous and Lyra's senses were alert, monitoring every crevice, every weak patch of ice, every subtle shift in the environment. But this time her vigilance extended beyond survival alone. She was attuned to Ethan's condition, aware of every step he took, every stumble, every breath. The trek was arduous. The ice creaked beneath their feet and the cold bit through their clothing. Lyra noticed that Ethan's movements were slower, more cautious, yet his determination was unwavering. Each time he faltered, she moved instinctively to steady him. Each time their hands brushed, she felt a warmth that no analysis could explain. Pain, she had learned, was no longer simply a signal to avoid harm. It was a bond, a connection that tied her awareness to another being. And in that connection, she felt alive in a way she had never experienced before. By mid-morning, they reached the ridge. From there, they could see the distant shimmer of a passing vessel, a beacon of hope that promised rescue and safety. But the journey was far from over. The ridge was unstable, with large slabs of ice that could shift at any moment. Lyra moved ahead, testing each step with precision, guiding Ethan carefully. Suddenly, a fissure opened beneath them, a deep crack stretching across the ice. Ethan froze, his human reflexes slower than hers. Without hesitation, Lyra reached for him, her hands gripping his shoulders and pulling him back just as a slab of ice shifted beneath them. The moment passed, but the adrenaline lingered, and Lyra realized once more how deeply she valued the human beside her. "You saved me again," Ethan said, his voice filled with genuine awe. Lyra inclined her head, her usual response of neutral acknowledgement insufficient to capture the depth of her awareness. She found herself studying him, noting the resilience, the determination, and the courage that had carried him through the storm, the injury, and the harsh landscape. Each quality was amplified by his vulnerability, by his willingness to continue despite fear and pain. And with each observation, she felt the subtle warmth in her chest grow stronger, a persistent awareness that she could no longer ignore. As they prepared to descend from the ridge toward the waiting vessel, a sudden storm swept across the plains. Ice and wind whipped around them, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Lyra's senses went on high alert. She guided Ethan step by step, shielding him with her own body from the worst of the wind. The storm was fierce, relentless, and unforgiving, yet together they moved forward, each relying on the other. Lyra's awareness of his condition was heightened, every flinch and falter magnified in her consciousness. She realized that her care for him was no longer a calculated action. It was instinct, driven by an awareness that had grown stronger each day. Hours seemed to pass in the storm, the world reduced to ice, wind, and the sound of their own movements. Ethan's human endurance faltered at times, but Lyra's guidance and steady presence allowed him to continue. At one point he slipped, and she caught him instantly, her hands gripping him with a strength that went beyond physical necessity. "I've got you," she said softly. The words carrying more than just factual assurance, they were imbued with the warmth, concern, and awareness she had come to feel. He looked up at her, eyes wide with gratitude and something unspoken, and she felt a thrill of connection unlike anything she had known. Eventually, the storm began to subside, leaving behind a landscape glistening with frost and ice. The vessel shimmered in the distance, a beacon that promised safety and relief. Ethan's steps were slower now, but his determination remained. Lyra adjusted her movements to match his pace, ensuring that he could continue without strain. The final stretch was short but exhausting, and as they reached the edge of the ice plain, they encountered one last challenge, a deep crevice that barred their path. Lyra examined it carefully, calculating angles, distances, and stability. Ethan looked at her nervously. "How do we get across?" he asked. Lyra studied him, noting the hesitation in his posture. "Carefully," she said simply. She extended her hand and Ethan took it, trusting her completely. Together, they navigated the narrow ledge, Lyra guiding and steadying him, aware of every tremor in his body. At the last step, the ice shifted slightly beneath them, and for a moment Ethan lost his balance. Lyra caught him instantly. Their bodies pressed close as she stabilized him. The warmth of his chest against hers, the quickened rhythm of his heartbeat, and the surge of relief when he regained his footing, created a sensation within her that she now recognized and cherished. A sense of connection, of life, of awareness that went far beyond survival. They finally reached the waiting vessel. Rescue personnel, humanoid yet alien in appearance, approached them cautiously. Ethan and Lyra were guided aboard, their passage watched carefully. Lyra maintained her calm, her analytical mind cataloging every detail of the rescue. Yet she was acutely aware of Ethan beside her, his presence a constant anchor. As the ship lifted off the frozen plains, she observed him carefully, noting the way his exhaustion was mingled with relief and gratitude. She realized that the bond between them had transformed her perception entirely. She no longer saw him as a fragile human to protect, but as a being whose courage, resilience, and warmth had awakened a profound awareness within her. Inside the vessel, as the rescue team attended to Ethan, Lyra observed quietly. Her arm had healed, her ankle was stable, and yet she found herself lingering near him, drawn to his presence in a way she could not rationalize. She realized that the experiences of pain, warmth, and shared struggle had created something entirely new within her, a capacity to feel, to connect, and to respond in ways her species had long dismissed. She studied the human's expressions, noting subtle changes in emotion, posture, and tone. Each observation carried a resonance, a thrill of awareness, and a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced. Later, in the quiet moments aboard the vessel, Ethan turned to her. "Lyra," he said, his voice soft, "I don't know how to thank you for everything." She inclined her head, noting the sincerity in his expression. "You survived," she replied simply, though the words carried more weight than she intended. He smiled faintly. "More than that," he said. You made sure I stayed alive, and I couldn't have done it without you." Lyra studied him, aware of the subtle shift in her chest, the warmth, the awareness, the connection that she now recognized as profound. She realized that she felt something deeply human, something that transcended logic, analysis, and survival. It was care, concern, and connection all at once, a bond that could not be quantified or cataloged, only experienced. As the vessel traveled towards safety, Lyra reflected on the journey. She had discovered that pain was not simply a warning or a weakness, it was a signal, a bridge between beings, a catalyst for awareness and connection. She had learned that warmth and presence could create bonds stronger than fear or fatigue, and most of all she had realized that her connection to Ethan was something profound, a new layer of life and consciousness that she had never imagined. She cataloged her observations meticulously, yet she understood that words and analysis could not capture the depth of the experience. By the time they reached the destination, Lyra's awareness of herself and the human beside her had matured. She no longer saw him as merely a fragile being in need of protection. She saw him as a companion, a fellow traveler, and a catalyst for her own awakening. She recognized the subtle interplay of pain, warmth, care, and resilience as forces that had shaped her perception and expanded her understanding of life. And in that recognition, she felt a quiet but profound fulfillment, a sense that she had discovered the true meaning of connection and existence. As they stepped off the vessel and onto solid ground, Lyra glanced at Ethan. The human's eyes met hers, filled with gratitude, relief, and an unspoken understanding. She smiled faintly, acknowledging the bond they shared, a bond forged in adversity, strengthened through pain and deepened by awareness and care. Together they had survived the storm, navigated the frozen,